The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. We've got a great episode coming up today. It's with a very interesting woman called Hilary Black. Hilary is a long-time activist and is now fighting the good fight at the boardroom level for Canopy Growth. So she has some really very interesting insights about what's going on there. As you'll hear, it was actually recorded the day after the US elections, which happened recently. Even though we know who the winner is now, it hasn't actually stopped the weirdness from continuing, even though it's now mid-December. However, one thing is for certain, cannabis was an undisputed winner, which we'll talk about. Anyway, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Hilary Black. Hilary is Chief Advocacy Officer for Canopy Growth, who are the largest Canadian licensed producer. Hilary, welcome.
Anuj, thank you for having me.
No, pleasure. How are you?
I am well. I mean, we are talking in kind of a wild time where it's the day where the world is holding its breath and we're waiting for the results of the US election to sort itself out. It's the day after the election. So it's an interesting moment in time, certainly. We're waiting to see what the fate of the world is going to be.
Yeah. It's a weird time, isn't it? But as we were talking just before we pressed record, some very positive news for the cannabis industry.
Indeed. While we're waiting to see who Americans have elected as their president, Americans have very clearly spoken and voted in favor of cannabis. So we have Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota that all voted yes to adult use, and then Mississippi who voted yes to medical use. So in the US, we now have 15 states that have legalized for adult use and 35 that have legalized for medical use, and at some point you got to think we're going to hit the tipping point. So I think about this as being really incredible momentum, yes, for the industry, but more importantly, momentum for justice, because moving towards the end of cannabis prohibition in the US, which is inherently and systematically racist, is going to provide a tremendous benefit to the entire world. Once we get the US to come on board, I think we'll really start being able to see some movement at the UN level, and then hopefully finally an end to this disastrous prohibition that America has very successfully exported around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that social justice angle is very important to what you do in your work. So we'll talk about that in a second. And it is exciting times in that respect, slightly scary times in other respects. But well, cool. Thank you, Hilary, for coming on the show. Why don't we start with the sort of traditional bit where you talk a bit about your background? Obviously, you've been involved in cannabis as an advocate for a long time. Maybe you can talk a bit about that and then how you ended up at the world's biggest cannabis company.
Certainly. It's been quite the journey. Basically, I graduated from high school just a couple of years ago, and I took a year off, and I was trying to decide if I was going to go into law or medicine, if I was going to study law or medicine, which, that in itself is a real decision of privilege. I come from a privileged community, and I have the ability to take a year to decide, am I going to study law or medicine? And in that time, I discovered hemp. I started learning about medical cannabis, and it led me to an experience with an older woman who had never tried cannabis before, who was bedridden from her arthritis. And I was connected to her, and she invited me over, and she wanted to try cannabis, and she buzzed me up into her apartment. And I think I was 18 at the time. And we climbed up on her bed, and we looked at a bag of cannabis together, and I rolled a joint and we smoked it together. This was back before it was terribly politically incorrect to smoke joints, because we all vaporize now, of course. But we smoked this joint together, and she started kind of moving and stretching, kind of like a cat. And it was like you could see these like chunks of cement almost falling off of her. She got up out of bed very tentatively, and she went to the kitchen and she made tea. And she carried 2 cups of tea back to where we were sitting. And then she started crying. And she was crying because she hadn't been able to carry 2 cups of tea in so long. And that was the dramatic influence that like 3 or 4 big inhalations of this joint had given her in terms of relief for her pain. Now, mind you, we were both under the euphoric influence of cannabis at the time, but she went on this really powerful, angry rant about how mad she was that she'd been lied to about this plant and that it had been kept away from her for so long, and how many other people in the world were suffering who had been lied to about this plant. And in that moment, I imagined an ocean of people who were suffering and a big wall, and that wall was prohibition and the cannabis plant on the other side of it. And I kind of felt this kind of mission and purpose land on me. And I decided that I was going to kick the crap out of that wall until it came crumbling down around the world. And that was kind of the very beginning of my story. And it was a real privilege to feel a sense of purpose in one's life starting at such a young age. And that was really where the journey began.
Fantastic. That's brilliant to hear that kind of passion and energy. And what happened next? What did you kind of move to from there?
Well, this is late 90s. So this was 1995. Now I've dated myself because I told you it was the year after I graduated from high school. So Canada and the United States at the time, particularly on the West Coast, the health crisis of the time was HIV and hepatitis C transmission epidemic. So Vancouver was a part of that, really the epicenter of HIV transmission and that epidemic in that time. And I ended up connecting with a group of incredible gay men who were HIV positive, living with HIV and AIDS, who were real political activists. And they were all looking for regular access to cannabis. And I started a delivery system. I had a pager, backpack, and a bicycle. And I started delivering cannabis to people living with HIV and AIDS and cancer patients for the most part. I had some people in my life who were organic growers and could really help me to source high quality, clean cannabis that didn't have molds and mildews and funguses and was flushed properly, and I could make it affordable. So it started as a delivery service. I ended up taking a year, and I moved actually to Amsterdam for a year. I spent 6 months living and working in Amsterdam after that delivery service, kind of understanding what it was like to live in a world where prohibition didn't exist, kind of normalize what it was like to distribute cannabis. And then when Proposition 215 passed in California, 97, first piece of pro-cannabis legislation, I moved to California to see how dispensaries and production and how the medical cannabis community was kind of coming to life. And then I moved back to Vancouver. And in 1997, it started in 96, but registered it as a nonprofit in 97, a civilly disobedient organization called the BC Compassion Club Society. And that was Canada's first medical cannabis organization. And we built an illegal but tolerated and supported healthcare organization. So we distributed medical cannabis to thousands and thousands of patients. I think that there were up to like 15,000 patients at some time. And we used the proceeds of the cannabis distribution to fund a wellness center. So the wellness center provided access to herbalists, nutritionists, counselors, acupuncture, substance use specialists, really provided a lot of the healthcare services that our clients needed, and they were kind of otherwise falling through the healthcare system. We helped a number of people start similar organizations across the country, in different cities. And then eventually this movement ended up playing out in the courts. And there were many, many court cases over the years where our government was dragged kicking and screaming and resisting every step of the way towards creating a legal medical framework for medical cannabis. And when we got to the stage of our legislation, where there was an allowance for federal producers and there were commercial licenses being given out for the production and distribution of medical cannabis, I decided at that point that I wanted to move from working in the left-wing, civilly disobedient, nonprofit, community-based organization kind of activist movement, and that I wanted to move and work in the legal industry and take a seat at the table and do my best to influence how that industry was born and would grow up in Canada. Definitely took some heat for that decision.
I was just about to ask, that's quite a big move. I mean, the kind of activism side of things and, well, let's call it grassroots or however you want to describe it, moving from there to the boardroom is quite a big jump. How did you find that yourself personally, and how did you find the reception to that as well?
Yeah, well, from the courtroom to the boardroom. Although back in those days, I was not a senior leader. I wasn't a senior executive the way that I am today. But the reception to my activist community, I mean, I was the first in the activist community to move over into the industry in Canada. So I really fell hard from my activist pedestal. I was a sellout and a traitor, and there were some things that happened on social media that were kind of humiliating and sexist and misogynist, the kinds of criticism that I think only a woman would receive. And I persevered. I knew that I was following my instincts and that I really had a responsibility to kind of have a seat at that table. So I started out working with one of the first 13 companies in Canada that got one of the licenses. And then in the very first big merger and acquisition, Tweed bought that company. And I was acquired like a goat on a farm in a real estate deal, for better or for worse. And that was when Tweed became Canopy Growth. And Canopy Growth became the umbrella company for a number of different individual brands and companies. And, I've always been incredibly supported by the teams of people that I have worked with in Canopy. Much more supported along my journey than I was originally sort of from my activist community. I mean, it's many years later, and so things have really changed. Many, many people who were part of the grassroots have found their way into the legal industry in one role or another.
Yeah. It's quite a journey to go through all of those bits. Did you have to do a lot of convincing to kind of find your niche in a corporate organization, or were you meeting together at the right time?
No, I didn't. I mean, my first role was director of patient education and advocacy. And this was something that I was very comfortable with, creating dosing guidelines and education tools and resources for patients. I had the opportunity to create like patient task forces for our government to consult with as the regulatory reform was evolving, got to have a budget to support different nonprofit organizations that were doing really cool work. And as we moved to legalization of recreational cannabis, which happened in 2018 in Canada, I kind of had a decision to make. Like, in some ways, I was ready to be done. I had sort of been the poster girl for the medical cannabis movement I'd been in it for almost 20 years at that point. And I was really considering taking my life and my career in a different direction. And then I decided that it was also an opportunity to kind of scale up my work, and that I could either leave and do something different, or I could build a team. I could take on more aspects of the business. I could really have an opportunity to sort of learn and stretch, and all with the goal of global impact, right? That like capitalism is a very powerful force in our world, and having the cannabis industry move from being a nonprofit, civilly disobedient movement to becoming a publicly traded industry that will potentially, hopefully, spread around the world, I really saw an opportunity to do my best to sort of ride that capitalist dragon and see how we can use the forces of economics to create good in the world.
Yeah, well, it's great. It's a noble aim, and I hope it's achieved. So tell us a bit more about, your role at Canopy and What does it involve? It's much broader than advocacy. It covers lots of areas, doesn't it?
So when we came to legalization, shortly after legalization, and I made this decision, the then leadership at Canopy promoted me into the C-suite. And at that time, I was the only female member of the C-suite. And I'm happy to say that is no longer the case. And so Chief Advocacy Officer is a unusual title in a publicly traded company. We basically made it up, and people, if you're the CFO or the CEO or the COO, everybody knows what you do, right? But like, what the hell is the Chief Advocacy Officer? So sometimes that work is about advocating for things that need to happen in the industry. And sometimes it's about advocating for things that need to happen inside the company. And so my team and I have quite a diverse mandate. So we continue to be responsible for our patient advocacy initiatives. We are responsible for all of our community investment work, all the social purpose work. Everything related to social justice in the cannabis industry is in my portfolio. And then also the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, where, Canopy is really working on an internal sort of transformation, the same kind of transformation really that the whole industry needs. And now this year, I'm also taking on ESG, so environment, social, and governance, the metrics by which the finance community can sort of score and rate and measure the good that a company does in the world.
Yeah, and we talked about that a bit before the show as well. People talk about ESG a lot, but it's really interesting. Clearly clearly Canopy is reacting to what the demands of the investment market and the shareholders are. How are you feeling that in reality?
It's been quite the learning curve. I mean, you have these external rating agencies that will rate you based on what they can find in the public arena, right? You can choose particular rating agencies that you want to work with and give them, disclose far more information and content to them. In some ways, I kind of really at first sort of felt like it was a racket. Like all of these external rating agencies were hitting us up and saying, if you don't complete this, 800-page questionnaire, okay, maybe not quite that long, and give us all this information, we're going to give you a 0. Or you can pay us this astronomical amount of money and we'll help to make sure that you don't have a 0. So, I had a lot of learning to do to sort of peel back the layers of the onion and to understand where the authentic value is versus the kind of shakedown that also seemed to be happening. But definitely from some of the institutional investors and the analysts, people are definitely starting to ask about ESG ratings and scores for the cannabis industry. And I'm really excited about it. Like this year, we'll be doing our first ever full environmental footprint assessment. So we'll be measuring, greenhouse gases and water and waste and looking at really assessing what our environmental footprint is and benchmarking that data, measuring it and benchmarking it is the first step towards creating your goals for year-over-year improvement, right? So that's sort of the E side of the ESG. The S side is really interesting in that part of what's measured in the S is internal. So pay ratios, gender balance, HR related issues, the diversity side of things. But then the S is also where you can start measuring and reporting on your impact in the community, right? So what are you spending your community investment dollars on? If you are investing in social justice work, how do you want to measure the impact of that work so that you can report on it? So this piece of work is actually, I think, really exciting, partially because there's an opportunity to pioneer really ethical leadership in the industry, but also because none of the investment community yet really is talking about how do we analyze the value and the importance of a cannabis company and how they're tackling the social justice or the diversity side of the work, which there is an imperative for the cannabis industry because of the inherently racist roots of prohibition and the disproportionate consequences of that prohibition. We have an exponentially larger responsibility to tackle those issues, as there is no balance between the people who are reaping the benefits of legalization versus the communities who have really been targeted and destroyed. So couple of years ago, if I'd thought that I would be really jazzed to be learning about like our disclosures and, what a material assessment is going to look like, and like really understanding how this work integrates how we report and communicate our work as a publicly traded company, I would have been very surprised. There we are.
It's really interesting because, ESG is relatively new. It's been called a few different names previously, and then the cannabis industry is relatively new as well. Are you looking at businesses in the non-cannabis world? Are there any sectors that are doing this well and you're sort of taking inspiration from?
There are definitely companies that I look at that I take inspiration from, not necessarily on the ESG front, but when I think about brands that you immediately associate them with very authentic social purpose work, like where the company and their impact on the world are totally one and the same. Like two of my favorites would be Patagonia. When you talk about Patagonia, and automatically you know that company from the ground up is built to be conscious and to be contributing and to be, providing solutions around climate change. And the other one that I think about is Ben and Jerry's, right? Like Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream company, they have been so bold around race-related issues, around social justice, around weighing in on regulatory reform. And I just think that both of those companies have done a really beautiful job of building themselves from the ground up with their purpose authentically woven into every piece of the company.
Yeah, they're good sources of inspiration. And do you find much cross-industry collaboration around these sort of issues? Because, it's an industry issue as much as anything else. And, there's some other big companies.
In Canada, there used to be more. And unfortunately, some of our competitors, you can't, it's podcast, so you can't see that I'm putting competitors in quotation marks, but some of my colleagues from the activist world, from the movement, ended up in different companies. And we, over the years, have had the ability to conspire together to co-fund particular projects or to move the needle on issues together. And unfortunately, some of my competitors, as many Canadian cannabis companies have needed to scale back, there have been layoffs. And unfortunately, some people and companies have chosen to start with laying off social purpose, social responsibility, patient advocacy, sustainability. And I think it's kind of old school thinking to think that when you need to trim some fat or tighten your belt in a company, that a place that you should snip your budget is around the people in the company that are responsible for driving positive impact. Right. Mm-hmm. I think that we are moving towards a time and a place in the world where successful companies understand that those functions are as essential as your HR or your finance or your ops team. So there's a little less collaboration these days than there have been previously.
Yeah, that is, I suppose, there's been some tough times for the big companies in Canada, particularly last year. So cuts needed to be made. And, I guess sometimes people can view people's approach to ESG as a bit of lip service. So perhaps there's been a bit of that. But hopefully when the storm is calmed down a little bit, they'll get back into that.
Well, you hold my feet to the fire, because we have committed publicly, and I am again, that we will have our first sort of ESG report this year, which will really just outline the process that we're going through this year around identifying, like doing the environmental footprint assessment, and then identifying like what the key areas are that we want to focus on and what our improvements are going to be. We also have committed to reporting publicly on the results of some of our diversity, equity, and inclusion diagnostic work internally. And so we will see both of those pieces. The diversity, equity, and inclusion is sort of a part of ESG, but we'll see that some of those pieces we'll start talking about them publicly, because I think you have to have accountability and trust. And even if the results of that diagnostic work is great, we got to start somewhere, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned diversity and inclusion. Perhaps we can drill down a little bit on that. At a high level, what's it all about and what's your kind of game plan in relation to that?
Well, so we talked a moment ago about the disconnect between the racialized communities who have been disproportionately punished by prohibition versus the not very diverse communities who have been benefiting from legalization, right? So I think social justice in the industry is definitely closely connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion inside a company. I don't think that a cannabis company has a foundation to stand on. I don't think you have any authenticity or integrity if you're talking about social justice and you're investing in social justice initiatives, but you're not focused on diversity in your own house, right? You got to get your own house in order. So the cannabis industry in Canada, the first 13 companies that were licensed, let me roll back a little more. When we legalized cannabis for adult use in Canada, we basically treated cannabis like plutonium, and we kind of legalized with a prohibitionist mentality. And what I mean by that is, in order to sell legalization to the conservative wing of our government, we basically needed to say, this is how we're going to reduce the harms of cannabis. Cannabis is harmful. Legalizing it is how we're going to reduce the harms. We're going to keep it out of the hands of children. We're going to keep it out of the hands of organized crime. We'll be able to better manage the harms and risks of cannabis. When what should have happened was, I am so sorry for 100 years of this legislation that is based on misinformation and racism. And this is a great injustice that the government of Canada has done to the people for almost 100 years. And we're going to apologize, we're going to repeal it, and we're going to create a legal cannabis industry that's totally inclusive and absolutely wraps our arms around everybody who has been engaged in the illicit industry up until this point. That is not what we did. So the barriers to access to the industry were very, very capital intensive. They were really intense. Like, in order to be able to get one of those original licenses, you basically had to build a bomb-proof building. You needed a massive safe. You needed like a huge amount of capital. And the security clearance that was required for the people who were actually working with the cannabis and managing it was like the requirements were very intense. And so the requirements, the original framework was not inclusive, and the consequences of that are continuing to play out. So we saw a movement, a civilly disobedient movement that was very female forward. It was very diverse. And then when we moved into a legal industry, we had a real avalanche of folks from venture capital, mining, other industries that tend to be fairly white and fairly male. And that's what the face of the legal industry looked like for the first many, many years. So across the industry in Canada, I would say in the States as well, although it's improving in the US because there's so much social justice legislation and requirements around licensing in the US, although that's a whole other rabbit hole we can get down because it's actually not working very well. But we ended up with a legal industry where, if you look at the board, on the C-suite, and even the VP level, you look across the companies and see who's got the equity, the big salaries, and all the power, pretty white and pretty male, right? And so now we have been doing some course correcting. So I'm pretty pleased with the progress that Canopy is making. I mean, we've also had a change in leadership and also gone through a massive reorg, which leaves room for moving people into higher level roles. And my new CEO, David Klein, is incredibly committed to diversity, equity, inclusion. I think coming from big publicly traded companies in the US, you have a different sense of the necessity of this kind of work. Perhaps it's a little bit newer for us in Canada. So all that to say that this year, the work that we are tackling around kind of our internal renovations, we partnered with a leading nonprofit in Canada as our advisors and consultants because it's not something that I have expertise in. And similar to the environmental footprint assessment, this is a year for benchmarking data, taking a snapshot of where are you so that you can improve on that work year over year. So we did a company-wide survey, spent a lot of time and energy trying to create a lot of participation in that survey, which is challenging when you have staff that are significantly manufacturing. But we did a big company-wide survey with a ton of energy around it. We've done a bunch of focus groups with our partner ran the focus groups, and they're for people who identify with a specific diversity identity. So one was for people who identify as Indigenous or Black. One was for people who identify as other folks of color. One was for women. One was for LGBTQ. One was for people who have disabilities. So we did a whole range of focus groups to sort of extract more information about people's experience. And then the leadership team goes through intensive interview process for us to kind of get a pulse on where they are in terms of their skill set and maturity level on their diversity journey. All of that gets cooked down into a report that we will then extract the highlights from and talk about at the end of the year. At the same time that we are reporting on the end of this fiscal, we will integrate sort of the snapshots and the benchmarking around the diversity work. So that's the kind of diagnostic part. The second part is starting education, right? And of course, education's harder to do in COVID because we're not together in person, and Zoom webinars are just not like being together in the same room. But we've rolled out executive boot camps. We've rolled out fundamentals and unconscious bias training, both in e-learning and in live webinars for the staff. And that work is continuing. Now, we also have committed to hiring a VP of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it'll be a very high level role in the company. The search is on for that particular role. So anybody who's listening to this podcast who has some experience with diversity transformation, in a publicly traded company, we're looking for the right gem to come and join my team. And that role will not just be an HR job. This is not just about the people work. Meaningful, authentic diversity work inside a company. First of all, that person needs to be reporting, quite high level in the company. And then it's kind of three buckets of work. It's the people work, which is your hiring policies. Do you have diverse hiring slates? Do you have diverse hiring panels? Do you have diversity principles woven into all of your HR policies? Do you have resource groups and affinity groups? Are there events and supportive organizations happening throughout the company? That's sort of the people part. And then there's the legal and policy part, which is really making sure that these principles are instituted from sort of the highest level in the company. And then there's the business aspect, where you actually want to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion principles are being integrated into your business plans. Right? So looking at your marketing plan, like having a lens on making sure that we are being inclusive, looking at your vendors and your supply chains. And, I'm not quite going to be able to tackle all of that this year, but that's where we're heading is, having a proper sort of questionnaire and assessment to understand how far along our potential business partners are in their diversity journey and selecting people to do business with who have also committed to this work.
Wow, you're going to be busy. That's quite a lot on your plate.
Well, I'm going to find a gem who's going to join my team, and then that work really connects to the external social justice work in the industry.
Yeah, what I liked about what you just said was many bits to it, but two big buckets are your sort of internal processes and culture and understanding to make sure that everyone is sort of slightly more enlightened in their approach to all of these issues. And then you've got the kind of outward facing aspect as well in terms of your comms and how you portray your company to the outside world, and including how you're recruiting. I only learned about this last year in terms of how job specs can unwittingly be very sexist and appeal to males over females just through the language that you use. So I can imagine that's sort of aspects like that are quite important.
Yeah, it's a real learning journey. It's not what I studied. And who am I kidding? I didn't go to university. I studied in the real Knox school of building a civilly disobedient cannabis movement in that industry. But you just have to hire the right people that have the right expertise, right, to help guide the journey. And it's something that it's a journey that we all need to be on. I often think now about this. I didn't think about it in my 20s, but I think about driving around with pounds and pounds of cannabis in a hockey bag in the trunk of my car. And I think about being very public and in the media about, I am breaking the law is wrong, I'm going to like outwardly, publicly disobey these laws until they've changed. And that kind of like brash courage was really partially based on my privilege, right? I am a white woman. I come from a affluent community, and I grew up knowing the police work for me. The police are there to protect me, right? If I get in trouble, I can go get them. If they come and, bust up a party, I can always sweet talk them. They will drive me home if they find me on a beach and we're having an illegal campfire, right? Like, this is my experience with the police, driving around with like copious amounts of cannabis when I was procuring it for my Compassion Club. Never once crossed my mind that I could get shot. Never. Was not anywhere near my reality. I wasn't even afraid of going to jail. I knew I would be able to battle it out in the courts. And that in itself is a part of my privilege, right? And that's just one of the ways that that my privilege has affected my life, right? If I was a woman of color, if I was in America, particularly in one of the more conservative places, if I had done the exact same work, very well could have spent my life in jail.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's great that you're aware of it and that you're using it and channeling it to try and make things better. So that's very good. Thank you, Hilary.
Well, I think learning about your privilege is so interesting in that you have to understand that like your privilege are the things that don't happen to you, right? So it's like, you walk into a nice clothing store and nobody is surprised that you're shopping in a nice clothing store, or, you achieve something of a certain standard, whether it's in your academic career or your personal career. And, and people aren't surprised that you have gotten there, like the journey of understanding my own privilege is one that is lifelong, right?
Yeah.
And it only comes from being able to hear other people's experiences of how they've lived their life and how the color of their skin has impacted their life and how they've been treated. And you realize, oh, that never happened to me. But I never had to deal with that,
Yeah.
So I would say I'm in the very beginning of my journey, really.
It's very honest of you. I thank you. I appreciate that. Cool. Well, thank you, Hilary. It's been brilliant to chat, and we could have talked a lot more. So I'd love to have you back on the show at some point, which would be lovely.
It has been a wonderful conversation. Now let's cross our fingers and send out our prayers and hope that by the end of the day, or maybe by tomorrow, that we find out what's happening with the leadership of America, and it certainly is going to affect what happens with cannabis legislation in the United States and around the world. So I would love to touch base with you again, and we'll see how things have changed in the time since we've chatted.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. Thank you, Hilary.